The flight attendant's hand struck hard, the sound cutting through the quiet cabin. Passengers gasped, watching in stunned silence, but the woman who had just been slapped didn't react, not with anger, not with tears. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number, her voice calm. "She just slapped me," she said. On the other end of the call, a man's voice hardened. "Which flight are you on?" The flight attendant smirked, unaware that in just moments her entire world was about to collapse because the woman she had just humiliated, she was the wife of the airline's owner. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. The passengers slowly filled the cabin, settling into their seats as the flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, checking seat belts and stowing luggage. Among them was Roz, dressed in a plain cotton dress with her hair neatly tied back. She had no jewelry on, no expensive handbag, nothing that would suggest she was anyone important. She stepped into the plane, quietly clutching her small purse as she found her seat in the business class section. The seat was comfortable, much better than the economy class she had been used to. She had traveled many times before, but never in luxury, and today she had chosen to sit in business class for the first time, not because she couldn't afford it, but because she rarely allowed herself such comforts. She preferred a simple life away from attention. She adjusted the seat belt around her waist and glanced out the window, watching the last of the luggage being loaded onto the plane. It was a long flight ahead, and she was looking forward to resting, but her peace was soon interrupted. A sharp voice cut through the air, dragging attention toward her. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you sure you're in the right seat?" The voice belonged to Lyanna, a senior flight attendant who carried herself with authority. She had been working for the airline for years and had learned how to judge people. With just one glance, she stood tall in her crisp uniform, looking down at Roz as if she had caught her in the wrong place. Roz turned her head and met Lyanna's piercing gaze. She nodded and reached into her purse, pulling out her boarding pass. "Yes, this is my seat," she said softly, handing over the ticket. Lyanna took the ticket with a frown, scanning it quickly. The seat number was correct, but something about Rashna didn't sit right with her. The woman didn't look like she belonged in business class. Her clothes were too simple, her demeanor too quiet. The other business class passengers were dressed in tailored suits and fine dresses, carrying designer bags and expensive watches, but this woman, she looked like someone who worked for them, not someone who traveled alongside them. Lyanna handed back the ticket with a forced smile, but her eyes held something else. "All right, then," she muttered before turning away. Rosie settled back into her seat, ignoring the uncomfortable feeling that had begun to creep in. She had experienced this kind of treatment before, being looked down upon because of the way she dressed, the way she carried herself. It didn't bother her much. She had learned long ago that people only saw what they wanted to see. As the last few passengers boarded, Lyanna moved through the cabin, greeting others with a pleasant smile, but when she passed Rashid and her expression tightened. Something about the woman made her uneasy. She didn't understand why someone like her was sitting here, a maid, maybe a servant who had managed to get her hands on a luxury seat. The thought irritated her, but she brushed it aside. Their flight was about to take off, and she had more important things to worry about. The plane roared to life as it began taxiing down the runway. Roz leaned her head back, closing her eyes as the aircraft lifted into the sky. She had no idea that the woman who had just questioned her presence would soon do something far worse, and when the truth came out, it wouldn't just be a lesson in humility, it would be the end of Lyanna's entire career. The flight had reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt signs flickered off. Passengers settled into their seats, some flipping through magazines while others scrolled on their phones. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, handing out drinks and attending to requests. Lyanna kept her posture straight, her polished shoes clicking softly against the cabin floor as she made her way toward the business class section. Again, her eyes drifted to Roz, who sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap. Something about the woman continued to bother her. Every time Lyanna looked at her, she felt irritated, as if Rash's mere presence in this section was a mistake that needed to be Corrected, she had served business class passengers for years, and they always carried themselves with a certain attitude and air of superiority that made them easy to recognize, but rashness. She sat with the stillness of someone who didn't belong. A man seated nearby, Adrian, adjusted his watch and leaned slightly toward Lina as she passed. "Excuse me," he said in a low voice, "I believe there's been an error. I don't think she's supposed to be here." Lina turned to him, her lips curving slightly. "I was thinking the same thing," she murmured. Rosie overheard them but kept her expression neutral. She had been in situations like this before where people assumed her worth based on her appearance. She chose to stay silent, but she could feel the heat rising in her chest. Lina straightened her uniform and walked toward Rosh's seat again. She stalked beside her and folded her arms. "Ma'am, may I see your ticket again?" Roz looked up, confusion flashing in her eyes. "You already checked it," she said, her voice calm. "I'd like to verify it once more," Lina insisted. Roz sighed and reached for her purse. She pulled out the ticket and handed it over. Lina snatched it, scanning it quickly. The seat number was correct, the class was correct, everything was in order, but instead of admitting that she had made a mistake, Lina forced a tight smile. "This ticket seems unusual," she said, tilting her head. "Where did you purchase it?" Rashna blinked, taken aback by the question. "Why does that matter?" Lina ignored the question and instead leaned in, slightly lowering her voice. "She do understand that business class has different standards, don't you? It's meant for a certain type of traveler." A tense silence settled between them. A few passengers nearby were now watching the interaction. Some shifted uncomfortably while others observed with quiet curiosity. Roz met Elle's gaze unshaken. "And what type of traveler do you think I am?" Lina forced another smile, this one thinner than before. "I am only asking routine questions. We have had cases where economy passengers were mistakenly assigned business class seats." A soft scoff came from behind them. A woman, Celeste, who had been quietly sipping her wine, turned her head. "That's funny," she said, tapping a finger against her glass. "She didn't ask anyone else those questions, just her." Lina stiffened. Celeste shrugged. "I've been flying business for years, and I've never seen a flight attendant ask where someone bought their ticket." Rasha remained quiet, but she could see the way Lina's face tensed. The attendant was trying to stay composed, but the cracks in her confidence were beginning to show. Still, Lina wasn't ready to back down. She placed the ticket on Rosie's tray table with a sharp motion. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice clipped, before turning on her heel and walking away. Roz exhaled slowly. She picked up the ticket and slipped it back into her purse. She thought that would be the end of it, that Lina would leave her alone now, but she was wrong, because Lina wasn't just irritated, she was angry, and soon her frustration would lead her to make a mistake she could never take back. Lina stormed into the galley, her grip tightening around the tray in her hands. She could still feel the weight of Celeste's words, the quiet judgment from the passengers. It made her blood boil. She had been working this job for years, dealing with all kinds of people, and yet today one woman, a woman who clearly didn't belong in business class, was making her feel like she was in the wrong. Hada, a junior flight attendant, glanced up from where she was organizing refreshments. "Something wrong?" she asked, noticing the tension on Lina's face. Lina let out a sharp breath, adjusting her posture. "Now," she muttered, forcing a smile. "Just dealing with seating issues." Hada frowned slightly but didn't push the matter. She had been working under Lina long enough to know that when she was in one of her moods it was best not to question her. Meanwhile, back in the business class cabin, Rosie sat with her hands in her lap, staring out the window. She could still feel the stares of a few passengers, could hear the quiet murmur. She wasn't new to this kind of treatment, but something about today felt different. It wasn't just judgment, it was something more personal. She didn't know why Lina had decided to single her out, but she had a feeling it wasn't over yet. Adrian, the man who had whispered to Lina earlier, cleared his throat. "You know," he said, tilting his head toward Roz, "if you had trouble getting a ticket, you could have just asked for an upgrade instead of taking someone else's seat." Roz turned to him slowly, her face unreadable. "I didn't take anyone's seat," she said evenly. Adrian smirked, sipping from his glass. "Sure." So Celeste, still seated nearby, rolled her eyes. "I don't No, what's more annoying, her being questioned like she's a criminal or you pretending you know anything about her. Adrian scoffed, but said nothing. He turned back to his tablet, acting as if the conversation had never happened. Rosna remained silent. She had nothing to prove to these people, but deep inside something stirred, an old feeling she had buried long ago, the same feeling she had when people looked at her and assumed she was less, assumed she was nothing more than the way she dressed. Minutes passed and the attendants began serving drinks. Lionel returned to the cabin, her expression once again composed. She moved through the rows, handing out glasses with a polite smile. When she reached Rosie's seat, she hesitated for only a second before placing a glass of water in front of her. "There you go," she said, her tone unreadable. She glanced at the drink, then back at Lionel. "Thank you," she said simply. Lionel didn't respond. She turned away, continuing her duties, but her mind was still unsettled. She had been so sure Rosie didn't belong yet. She had no proof, and that made her frustration grow, but she wouldn't have to wait much longer because soon an opportunity would come, a small moment, one where Lionel could remind this woman exactly where she stood, and when that moment came she wouldn't hesitate. The cabin remained quiet, with only the hum of the engines filling the air. Most passengers were settled into their seats, sipping their drinks or flipping through in-flight entertainment. The tension for earlier had started to fade, but Rosa could still feel the occasional glance in her direction. She ignored it, focusing on the steady view outside the window. Lionel, however, wasn't done watching her. She moved through the aisles, keeping an eye on every movement Roz made. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was personal. Something about the woman's calmness, her refusal to be rattled, made Lionel's irritation grow. She wanted to see her flustered, to see her embarrassed, to prove that she didn't belong in business class. A sudden jolt ran through the plane as mild turbulence hit, causing the beverage cart to shake slightly. Hada, who was serving a passenger, few Rosa had paused to steady herself. Lionel, using the moment to distract herself, turned and grabbed a napkin from the cart. Just as she was about to turn away, Roz stood from her seat, adjusting her purse strap on her shoulder. She moved carefully toward the aisle, stepping past the cart to head toward the restroom. Lionel's eyes narrowed. She immediately stepped in front of Roz, blocking her path. "Where are you going?" she asked sharply. She stopped, startled by the sudden confrontation. "To the restroom," she answered. Lionel folded her arms. "The business class restroom is for business class passengers only." Rosh's brows pulled together. "And I am a business class passenger." The air between them thickened. Passengers nearby turned their heads slightly, pretending not to listen while clearly paying attention. Lionel let out a small breathy laugh. "You know," she said in a hushed voice, "it's okay to admit if you're in the wrong place. If you're more comfortable using the economy restroom, I can let you go there." She exhaled slowly, her patient thinning. "I paid for this seat. I have just as much right to use this restroom as anyone else here." Lionel's smile turned cold. "That's interesting," she murmured, "because I've never seen someone in business class without a single luxury item on them. No watch, no jewelry, no expensive handbag, just a simple dress." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably at her words. Celeste, seated nearby, let out a quiet scoff, but didn't speak yet. She held Lionel's gaze unshaken. "I didn't know my outfit needed your approval to use the restroom." Lionel's jaw tightened. She was losing control of the situation, and she hated it. She had expected Roz to react defensively, maybe even shrink away in embarrassment, but instead the woman remained perfect, composed, standing tall despite the subtle humiliation Lionel was trying to force upon her. Roz moved to step past her, but Lionel shifted in front of her. "Again, you're holding up the aisle," Lionel said coolly. "I suggest you wait." Rosie clenched her jaw but didn't argue. She stepped back slightly, giving Lionel one last look before returning to her seat. Celeste watched the entire exchange and let out a sigh that was pathetic. She muttered loud enough for Lionel to hear. Lionel ignored her, turning sharply on her heel as she pushed the beverage cart forward. She wasn't done yet, not even close, because now she wasn't just irritated, she was determined, and the next time Roz stepped out of line she wouldn't just use words to put her back in her place. The tension in the cabin didn't fade. Even though Rosie had returned to her seat, she could feel the weight of Lionel's presence lingering nearby. The flight attendant moved. Celeste leaned in close to Rashna and whispered, "I have a problem with you, and I'm not even trying to hide it." Roshni gave her a small nod but didn't say anything. She had seen people like Lionel before, people who thought power came from uniform and status, and she wasn't worth arguing with. But something told her that Lionel wasn't going to let this go. The flight continued with Attendant serving meals and passengers getting comfortable. The atmosphere seemed to settle, but only for a while. A soft chime rang through the cabin signaling that a passenger needed assistance. Lionel, still restless, saw the light blinking above Rossi's seat, her lips pressed into a thin smile. This was her chance. She walked over, slowly adjusting her uniform before stopping beside Rosie's seat. "Yes?" she asked in a clipped tone. Roz looked up, confused. "I didn't call for assistance." Lionel's smile didn't waver. "Are you sure the call light above your seat is on?" Rosie glanced up, her brows pulling together. She hadn't touched the button. Lionel sighed dramatically. "If you don't need help, please be mindful not to press buttons you don't understand." A few passengers turned their heads, catching the remark. Celeste let out a quiet chuckle under her breath. "That's interesting," Celeste said. "I saw her sitting still the whole time." "You sure the button wasn't, I don't know, pressed by accident from somewhere else?" Lionel's expression didn't change, but her fingers curled slightly at her sides. "I don't. If the light came from this seat, then it must have been pressed," she said smoothly. Roz looked at her steadily and said, "I didn't press it." Lionel tilted her head, her smile still in place, and said, "Well, next time just be careful." She reached over and turned off the call light before slowly walking away. Roz watched her walk away, her patience wearing thin by the minute. She hadn't pressed the button, and she had a strong feeling that Lionel knew that too, but why was she so? Celeste shook her head and said, "She's playing games with you." Roz slowly breathed out, "I know." Celeste studied her for a moment. "You're not going to let her win, are you?" Rosie asked. "No, I'm not," she murmured. "But I don't have to do anything either, because soon Lionel would push too far and there would be no turning back." The flight continued, but the tension between Roshne and Lionel stayed high. Every once in a while Lionel would look in Roshi's direction as if waiting for an opportunity to challenge her again. Rosie, however, remained composed, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her expression giving nothing away. Lionel moved through the cabin, but no matter how many passengers she assisted, her mind kept circling back to Roz, and she hated how unaffected the woman seemed. Most passengers would have apologized by now, embarrassed by the constant scrutiny, but Roz and she sat there, completely unshaken, and it irritated Lionel more than she wanted to admit. A few rows away, Adrian smirked as he leaned towards Celeste and said, "She really has it out for her." Celeste rolled her eyes and said, "It's getting embarrassing at this point." In the galley, Hannah was refilling a tray of drinks when Lionel stormed in with a sharp breath. Hannah gave her a quick glance and said, "You okay?" Lionel then grabbed a cloth and wiped an invisible stain off the counter. "She's getting under my skin," Hannah muttered. "Who are you?" Lionel didn't answer at first, but Hannah knew she had seen Lionel hovering over Wash's seat. Searching for reasons to challenge her, Lionel just let it go. Hannah said carefully, "You checked her ticket. She's a business class passenger like everyone else. Maybe stop making a big deal out of it." Lionel's jaw tightened. "You don't get it. She doesn't act like she belongs here." Hannah crossed her arms. "Or maybe you don't like the fact that she does." Lionel shot her a glare but said nothing. Hannah shook her head and grabbed the tray. "Just do your job and leave her alone. The last thing you need is a complaint against." Lionel wasn't worried about Rosa complaining. She wanted her to break down and admit that she wasn't like the other people in business class. When she saw Roshi stand up a few minutes later and adjust the strap of her purse again, she didn't think twice before following her. This time, she wasn't going to let Rosa walk away without consequences because, in her mind, Rosa had already crossed a line, and Lionel was ready to put her back in her place. Roz made her way toward the restroom again, her step steady despite the weight of Lionel's constant scrutiny. She wasn't one to let things bother her easily, but it was clear now Lionel wasn't just being rude, she was determined to humiliate her. As she reached the restroom door and reached for the handle, a sharp grip closed around her wrist. "Not so fast." Lionel's voice came from behind her. Rosie turned slowly, her eyes meeting Lionel's. The flight attendant's expression was firm, her nails digging slightly into Washi's skin before she released her grip. "This Rosalia looked at the small occupied/vacant sign and saw that it was green. The bathroom was empty, so it didn't look like it was unavailable to her. "It doesn't look unavailable to me," she said evenly. Lionel's smile was tight. It was now. People nearby turned their heads slightly, sensing another argument. Rosalia could feel the weight of their gazes on her, but she wouldn't give Lionel the pleasure of reacting. "Lionel," Hannah's voice cut in as she approached, her eyebrows pulling together in confusion. "What's going on?" Lionel barely turned her head. "I was just explaining that this restroom is off limits for now." Hannah frowned, glancing at the vacant sign. Since when Lionel's jaw clenched slightly. Since now Hannah stared at her for a moment before shifting her gaze to Rosa, clearly sensing that something was off. "Lionel," she said in a lower voice, "it's just a restroom. Let her use it." Lionel exhaled sharply through her nose. "There are restrooms in economy air." Hush fell over the small space. Rosa felt the words settle in, and she wasn't the only. Hannah looked at her and her eyes darkened. Hannah's voice was sharp this time. "What's your problem?" Lionel finally turned to face her, her anger boiling over. "My problem is that she doesn't belong in business class." Hannah looked at her, and the words came out louder than she meant. A few people gasped, and Celeste, who was still sitting, let out an exaggerated scoff. "Wow," she finally said it out loud. Rose stood still, her heart steady. Lionel was falling apart, and she knew it. Anything. Lionel did something no one expected. Without warning, without thinking, she reached out and slapped Rashi across the face. A loud sharp crack echoed through the cabin. The entire aisle fell into stunned silence. Rashi's head turned slightly from the force, her cheek burning, but she didn't step back, she didn't stagger, she simply turned her gaze back to Lionel, her expression unreadable. Passengers gaped in shock. Hannah's hand flew to her mouth. A businessman, who had been watching, dropped his pen onto his tray. Table 4. When Lionel realized what she had done, she held her breath and her hand stayed still in the air. There was a long pause in the silence. Then, slowly, Rosie lifted her hand, not to hit back or touch her burning cheek, but to reach for the small purse that hung from her shoulder. When she pulled out her phone, Lionel's stomach dropped because Rosie wasn't calling the police, she was calling someone much worse. The whole business class cabin was frozen in shock, and the sound of the slap could still be heard. Lionel's breathing was off, and her fingers were trembling slightly from what she had just done. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a disaster. Rasha's cheek hurt, but she didn't react. She didn't raise her hand to touch it, she didn't flinch, she didn't even look shaken up. Instead, she calmly unlocked her phone, her fingers moving slowly on purpose. People nearby watched, their eyes moving back and forth between her and Lionel, waiting for what would happen next. Hannah had just finished. Noticed everything and spoke up first. "What the hell did you just do?" Lionel's throat felt dry as her mind tried to come up with an excuse for what had happened, but there was none. She had let her emotions get the best of her, and now there was no going back. "I'm sorry," she began, but the words didn't feel strong as they left her mouth. Rosie's phone rang twice, and a deep voice answered. "Are you okay?" The voice was calm, but there was something dangerous underneath it. Lionel's breath caught. She recognized that voice, or tilted her head slightly, keeping her gaze locked on Lionel's as she spoke into the phone. "I'm fine," she said, her voice as calm as ever, "but there's been an incident." Lionel swallowed hard. The businessman seated a row away. Daniel leaned forward, slightly intrigued. Celeste let out a low whistle. "Oh, you're in trouble," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. Lionel stepped back, her face draining of color she hadn't asked for. This woman's full name hadn't even. She was so calm and sure of herself that it sent a chill down Lionel's spine. "Tell me everything," the voice on the other end of the phone said. Rosie's lips curled slightly, but not with smirk or arrogance. They curled with a quiet understanding that everything was about to change. "A flight attendant just slapped me," she said. There was silence on the other end of the call, and then the voice spoke again. "What flight are you on?" Lionel's breathing quickened, and Hannah looked between them. Rashi looked at her for a split second before answering, "My husband." This caused a resounding gasp of shock throughout the cabin. Adrian, the man who had been whispering that Roz didn't belong, instantly straightened up in his seat, realizing he had been very, very wrong. Lionel's lips parted slightly in shock and panic, and she repeated, "Your husband." Roz didn't break eye contact as she spoke on the phone. "Yes, love," her tone changing a little. "I'm on flight 372. The voice on the other end of the line said something that made Lionel's stomach twist violently. "I'll handle it," she said, and the call ended. Roz put the phone back in her purse and stepped past Lionel, who was standing as straight as ever. Lionel asked, "Who is your husband?" And Roz stopped and looked at her with a small smile on her face. "D. Rajjan," she said, and as soon as the name came out, "Invisible." Lioness Celeste let out a shocked laugh and said, "Oh, this is better than a movie." Lioness stumbled a little and grabbed the side of a seat for support. Dear Rajan was the owner of the airline she worked for. He had built an empire in the aviation industry, and his name carried more power than she could ever imagine. She had just slapped his wife. Lionel's mind raced, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation and undo what she had done, but there was no way to undo it because now the whole plane knew, and even worse, Dear Rajan. Nichu had to let out a slow breath and whispered, "Oh Lionel, you just ruined your whole life." Lionel didn't answer because she knew Hannah was right. She felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Her body stayed still, but her mind was racing, trying to figure out how to fix the mess she had just made. She had socked this woman in front of a whole cabin full of people who thought she was nothing more than an idiot. Out of profession made, but now she knew the truth. Rashi wasn't just a passenger or some random person who walked into business class. She was the wife of Vir Rajan, the man who ran the airline she worked for. When Lionel realized this, her stomach twisted violently. Other passengers whispered to each other, and Adrian, who had been so quick to think Rosie didn't know what was going on, gave her a knowing look. The Long suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear into his seat. Celeste, on the other hand, had a smug grin on her face and was sipping her wine with the satisfaction of seeing karma play out in real time. Hannah's face couldn't be read, but the disappointment in her eyes was clear. Lana said, "You need to sit down right now." Lionel barely heard her and her hands were shaking as she tried to calm down. This couldn't be happening. She had worked for this airline for years, built a reputation, and earned Lionel's respect. Colleagues, and now all of that was hanging by a thread because of one slap. No, she thought wildly, it wasn't just the slap, it was everything: the questioning, the humiliation, the way she had tried to force Rashna into proving she belonged, and worst of all, she had done it loudly in front of an audience, making sure everyone knew she didn't think Rashna deserved to be there. Now everyone was watching her downfall. The sudden ding of the intercom made her flinch, then the captain's voice echoed through the cabin, "Miss Lionel, please report to the cockpit." Celeste let out a low chuckle and said under her breath, "Oh, this just keeps getting better." Lionel swallowed hard, her throat dry, and forced her legs to move as she stepped away from Rosie and walked toward the front of the plane. It felt like everyone in the cabin was staring at her, burning into her back, waiting to see what would happen next. As she walked into the cockpit, the door shut softly behind her, and the middle-aged captain didn't look at her right away. His hands remained steady on the controls, but his jaw was tight, his eyes locked onto the panel in front of him. But it wasn't the captain who spoke first. A voice crackled through the speaker of the in-flight communication screen. The screen displayed a video call from an office back on the ground. The man on the other end had shark features, his dark eyes unreadable. Line of her breath caught. She recognized him immediately. He was one of six Rajan's senior executives. "You're aware of who you just assaulted, correct?" he asked, his voice cold. Lyanna opened her mouth, but no words came up. The executive's expression didn't change. I'll make this brief, he continued. Mr. Rajan has been informed of your actions. We've been given direct orders effect immediately. You are removed from duty for the remainder of this flight. Upon landing, security will be waiting to escort you off the aircraft. You will be placed under disciplinary review, and I strongly suggest you prepare a formal statement, because if Mr. Rajan chooses to pursue this further, you won't just lose your job, and you'll never work in this industry again. The captain finally turned his head a little. You should return to your seat, Lyanna, while you still have one, he said in a quiet but firm voice. Lyanna couldn't breathe. She wanted to beg, to explain, to say something that would make things right, but there was nothing she could say. She had done this to herself. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the cockpit, her hands cold and her face burning as she re-entered the business class cabin. She felt the shift in the air immediately. The passengers who had once barely acknowledged her presence now watched her closely, some with curiosity, others with satisfaction. She avoided their eyes, walking past them stiffly, trying to keep whatever dignity she had left. Then she saw Renee. She was still seated, still calm, still composed. She hadn't gloated, hadn't smiled smugly, hadn't said a single word that made it worse. Lyanna stopped near her seat, hesitating. She wanted to say something, anything, but before she could, a quiet chime rang through the cabin, one that Lyanna had never wanted to hear in this situation. The seatbelt sign went off. They were starting to descend, and Lyanna knew what was waiting for her on the ground, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The plane continued to descend, and with each second that went by, she could feel the walls closing in on her. The engines hummed steadily, and the lights above her flickered slightly as the plane changed altitude. The weight of what was waiting for her on the ground pressed down like a crushing force. Years walking through airports with competence, her uniform crisp, her posture straight, commanding respect with just a glance, but now for the first time she felt small. She returned to the galley, her steps slower than before. Hannah was already there, arms crossed, watching her carefully. The moment Lyanna stepped inside, Hannah let out a breath, shaking her head. They're waiting for you, she said simply. Lyanna pressed her lips together. She already knew that security, the executives, and worst of all, Rajan himself. Lyanna had continued, her voice softer now. Do you even realize how badly you messed up? Lyanna let out a bitter breath, gripping the edge of the counter. I know, Hannah sighed, rubbing her temples. No, I don't think you do. This isn't just about you losing your job. This isn't a normal passenger complaint that'll disappear after a few meetings with HR. You put your hands on the wife of one of the most powerful men in the airline industry. Do you have any idea what that means? Lyanna closed her eyes for a moment. She did know it meant she had not only ruined her career but also destroyed any chance of recovering from this. Airlines talked, airports talked. One mistake could follow someone forever, especially one like this. But what frustrated her the most, what made her stomach twist painfully, was that she had done it over something so stupid. She had let her pride, her arrogance, and her own assumptions push her into making the worst decision of her life. She had looked at Roz and assumed she was nothing, and now Roz was the one who held all the power. Hannah's voice softened again. Look, I don't know what's going to happen when we land, but I suggest you start thinking about what you're going to say, because right now, Lyanna, you have two choices: own up to what you did, or let this be the end of you. Lyanna didn't answer. Hannah sighed again, bidding her one last look before walking away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The descent continued, and back in the business class cabin, Rosie sat quietly, buckling her seat belt as the flight attendants made their final round sounds. She could feel the energy in the air, some passengers sneaking glances at her, others too embarrassed to look in her direction. After watching what had happened, Adrian, who had been so smug earlier, now sat stiffly in his seat, eyes fixed on the window. He hadn't spoken another word after realizing who Rashi was. Celeste, on the other hand, seemed fully entertained, occasionally stealing glances toward Lyanna whenever she passed Roz, and wasn't interested in their reactions. Her focus was elsewhere. She reached for her phone again, checking for updates. A message from Ver popped up on her screen. "First security is ready. They'll escort her off the plane first. Wait for me at the terminal." She exhaled, slowly locking the screen. It wasn't anger that she felt, at least not anymore. It was something else. Lyanna had tried to humiliate her, had judged her based on appearance, and had even resorted to violence, but in the end she had only destroyed herself. Rosie didn't need revenge. She didn't need to shout or demand justice. She just needed to wait. The plane dipped lower, the runway now visible through the small oval windows. The intercom crackled as the captain's voice returned. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." A hush fell over the cabin. Lyanna forced herself to straighten up, moving through the aisles one last time. She could feel the way passengers looked at her now, not with respect, not with the usual polite indifference, but with curiosity, with quiet judgment. She had been the one in control at the start of this flight. Now she was the one everyone pied. As the wheels touched the ground, a heavy silence settled over her. Her time was up, and she had never been more terrified in her entire life. The moment the wheels touched the runway, Lyanna's body tensed. The usual sense of relief that came with landing a flight wasn't there. Instead, a wave of dread crashed over her, suffocating and inescapable. She gripped the side of a seat as the aircraft slowed, her breath shallow. This was at the final few moments before everything she had built came crashing down. The passengers sat in silence, waiting for the usual instructions, but there was something different about the energy in the cabin. They were just waiting to disembark. They were waiting to see what would happen next. Rashi remained still, her seatbelt fastened, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She didn't look at Lyanna, didn't acknowledge the growing panic on the flight attendant's face. She didn't have to. Lyanna had already unraveled on her own. The intercom crackled and the captain's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 3:45 p.m. For your safety, please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. Thank you for flying with us." The seatbelt sign remained on, but Lyanna knew it wouldn't be for long. She glanced toward the front of the plane, where the entrance to the jet bridge would soon be connected, but instead of the usual crew members waiting outside, she saw them. Two uniformed security officers stood just beyond the glass window of the jet bridge. Their hands were clasped in front of them, their expressions unreadable. They were waiting for her. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Hatta returned from the galley, stopping just behind her. She must have seen them too, because her expression was grim. "You should start preparing yourself," Hatta murmured. Lyanna's throat tightened. "I can explain." Hatta turned to her sharply. "Explain what?" "That you spent an entire flight harassing a passenger because you assumed she was beneath you, that you slapped her in front of an entire cab full of witnesses." She exhaled heavily. "Lyanna, there is no explanation. There's just accountability." Lyanna's fingers clenched at her sides. The plane slowed to a complete stop, and a moment later the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign turning off filled the cabin. The usual rustling of passengers gathering their belongings began, but the usual rush to the aisles was absent. Everyone was still watching. The flight attendant near the door hesitated, her fingers hovering over the intercom button before pressing it. "Miss Lawn, please proceed to the front of the aircraft immediately." The words cut through the silence. Passengers turned their heads, some openly staring, others pretending to be occupied with their luggage but listening closely. Celeste leaned back in her seat, shaking her head with an amused sigh. "Well, this is awkward." Lyanna's legs felt like lead as she took a step forward. Each movement felt heavier than the last, like she was dragging the weight of her own downfall with her. As she walked past Rash's seat, she slowed slightly, hoping for some reaction, a glance, a smirk. Anything but. Rashi remained still, looking at her with the same composed expression she had worn throughout the flight. It wasn't the look of someone who wanted revenge, it was the look of someone who had already won. Lyanna turned away quickly, shame burning her skin as she walked toward the front of the aircraft. The flight crew by the door stepped aside as she approached, their expressions carefully neutral. No one spoke, no one needed to. The door opened, the security officers stepped inside. "Lyanna Carter," one of them asked. Her mouth went dry. "Yes," she cooked. "You need to come with us." A murmur rippled through the passengers. She swallowed hard and nodded with shaking hands. She unpinned her flight attendant badge from her uniform, gripping it tightly for a moment before forcing herself to let go. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, she felt the finality of it all settled deep into her bones. She had started this flight believing she was untouchable. Now she was walking off of it with nothing, and on the other side of that jet bridge the Rajan was waiting. Lyanna stepped onto the jet bridge, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The air inside felt colder than the aircraft, or maybe it was just the chill settling deep within her bones. Her once confident stride had become hesitant, her body stiff with the weight of her actions. Every step forward felt like stepping toward the inevitable. The security officers flanked her on either side, their movements steady, professional, but their presence alone made her feel suffocated. She had never been on this side of authority before, never been the one escorted, the one under scrutiny, the one at risk of losing everything. As she neared the terminal exit, a new figure came into view, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark tailored suit. Byron stood waiting just beyond the glass doors. His presence alone commanded attention. Passengers walking past him instinctively lowered their voices. Airport staff straightened their postures, and even the security officers escorting Lioness seemed more alert. Lioness had never met him in person, but she had heard his name countless times. The airline's executives spoke of him with deep respect. The employees whispered about him like he was a legend. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to be heard, and now she had to face him. Her stomach twisted painfully as she stepped through the doors, her feet halting just a few steps away from him. The security officers stepped back slightly, giving them space, but still standing close enough to remind her that she wasn't free to simply walk away. For a long, agonizing moment, Veer said nothing. His sharp gaze flickered over her, studying her with a level of calm that was far more unsettling than anger. He wasn't the type to lash out or lose his temper. He was the type to make decisions with quiet precision, and Lioness knew that whatever he had already decided, it wouldn't be in her favor. She opened her mouth, desperate to say something, anything that might fix the damage she had done. Mr. Rajan, he lifted a hand, silencing her instantly. Lioness swallowed hard, her words dying in her throat. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low but firm. Do you have any idea what you've done? Lioness' fingers trembled at her sides. She wanted to defend herself, to say that she had made a mistake, that she hadn't meant for things to escalate the way they did, but she knew better than to insult his intelligence with excuses. Still, her voice came out in a whisper. It was a personal. I didn't know who she was. A flicker of something dangerous passed through V's eyes. You didn't need to know who she was, he said evenly. You only needed to treat her with basic respect. Lioness' breath caught. You judged her based on nothing but her appearance. You questioned her presence in business class. You humiliated her in. Then when you couldn't get her to react, you hit her. His words were cold and cut through any weak defenses she had left. Lioness' whole body felt cold. She hesitated. I lost my temper, she said. I know that, and I regret it. He stood over her, making her feel unbearably small. Your regret means nothing, he said. Not to me, not to my wife. Lioness' stomach twisted painfully. I built this airline on the foundation of respect and professionalism. Continued. Thousands of employees work under my name, and every single one of them is a reflection of the company I created, and today you prove to be the kind of person who does not belong here. Lioness felt her breath grow unsteady. Ver turned slightly, gesturing toward one of the executives standing nearby. A middle-aged man in a gray suit stepped forward, a folder in his hand. Without a word, he handed it to bearer, who flipped it open and pulled out a single document. Lioness barely had time to process it before he extended it toward her. Effective immediately, he said, your employment with this airline is terminated. The words hit her harder than the slap she had given Rasha. Her vision blurred slightly as she stared at the document. The official letter stamped with the airline's logo detailed her dismissal in cold, precise wording. There was no room for negotiation, no offer of suspension or retraining. This was final. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I've worked here for 10 years. This job is all I have. B's expression didn't change. You should have thought about that before you let your arrogance destroy it. Tears burned in the corners of Lioness' eyes, but she forced them down. Security will escort you out of the airport. V added, your belongings will be sent to you. You are not to enter any of our facilities again. Lioness felt like she was standing on a crumbling edge, one wrong step away from losing herself completely. Is there anything I can do? She asked, her voice desperate. Now Ver studied her for a long moment, then let out a quiet sigh. That depends, he said. Are you asking how to fix your career? Lionel hesitated, nodding slightly. Then no, he said bluntly, there is nothing you can do. She felt her heart crack. But if you're asking how to fix yourself, he continued, then maybe start by asking why you thought a woman in a simple dress didn't deserve to be treated like a human being. Lionel's breath shuddered out of her lungs. She wanted to argue, to insist that it hadn't been like that, that she hadn't meant to be cruel, but deep down she knew she had seen Rashi as less, and now she had paid the price for it. The weight of everything came crashing down on her, the reality that she had lost her job, that she would never work in this industry again, that she had humiliated herself in front of an entire plane full of people, all because of a woman she had assumed was beneath her. She didn't respond. She couldn't forbade the small nod to the security officers take her out. Lionel's chest tightened as they stepped forward. Her legs felt weak as she forced herself to move her footsteps, heavy as she was, led through the terminal. Passengers who had witnessed the incident were already moving through the airport, some glancing at her as she passed, some whispered, others shook their heads. Celeste, walking toward baggage claim, smirked as she passed. That was hard to watch, she said with false sympathy. Well, for you anyway. Lionel clenched her fists, keeping her head down as she kept walking. She had started this flight thinking she was in control. Now she was nothing more than a disgraced former employee walking out of the very airport she once ruled over and and she had never lifted a hand against her, never raised her voice, but she had won, and the worst part, Lionel knew she deserved it. Lionel's feet dragged against the polished airport floor as she was escorted through the terminal, the weight of her downfall pressing down on her shoulders like a boulder. She had been in this airport hundreds of times, walking these same halls with her head held high, her uniform pristine, her presence commanding respect. But today she was being escorted out like a criminal. The officers walked next to her without making eye contact or being rough with her. They didn't need to grip her arms or force her to move faster. They didn't need to. She already had the humiliation of being watched by passengers, the sound of employees averting their eyes, and ground staff realizing that she was no longer one of them was enough of a punishment. Her mind was racing with ideas for how to fix the mess she had made. Would another airline take her? Could she make the situation work in her favor? But every thought ended in the same sinking realization. This wasn't just about losing her job, this was about losing everything. She had been with this airline for 10 years. She had built her career here, climbed through the ranks, believed she was untouchable, and in less than a few hours she had destroyed it all with her own arrogance. As they neared the exit, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. Lionel, she flinched at the familiar voice and turned slightly. Hada, her former colleague. Because that's what she was. Hada, now former, stood a few feet away with a confused look on her face. She held a small bag with Lionel's stolen belongings from the plane. Lionel swallowed hard, afraid of what Hada would say. But when Hada spoke, her voice wasn't mean or mocking, it was tired. You didn't have to let it get this far, Hannah said, shaking her head as she handed Lionel the bag. Lionel took it slowly, her fingers curling around the strap. I know, Hannah said in a high-pitched voice. I told you to let it go. Warned you. Lionel exhaled sharply, looking down. I thought I was right, and now Hada challenged. Lionel hesitated, then forced herself to meet Hada's eyes. Now I know I wasn't. Hada studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. It's too late for this job, Lionel, she said, voice firm but not unkind. But maybe it's not too late for you to figure out why you did what you did. Lionel's throat tightened. There were so many things she could have said, so many ways she could have tried to defend herself, but there was nothing. She had thought Rashi was beneath her, so she had put her down, questioned her, and disrespected her. When that wasn't enough, she hit her because she couldn't accept that someone like Rashi could belong in business class, that someone who didn't look rich could afford the same luxuries as the passenger she had spent years serving. She had spent her whole career thinking she knew who belonged where, and today she was shown she was wrong in the most painful way possible. She deserved to be shown. Wrong-headed gave her a long look before stepping back. Take care of yourself, Lyanna, and with that she turned and walked away. Lyanna watched her go, feeling a strange hollow settle inside her chest. For the first time in her life she had no uniform, no title, no position of authority to cling to. She was just Lyanna, and she wasn't sure who that was without the power she once held. The security officers motioned for her to continue walking. She did, and just as she was about to step through the automatic exit doors she heard another voice, one that made her entire body go still. That's her. Lyanna turned her head slowly, dread current in her stomach. Rashi stood a few feet away, her posture still composed, her expression unreadable. But this time she wasn't alone. John stood beside her. His presence alone was enough to make Lyanna feel like she was shrinking into herself. He wasn't yelling, wasn't threatening her, but the quiet intensity in his eyes was worse. She forced herself to straighten. Mr. Rajan, she started, her voice weak. He didn't respond at first. He simply looked at her, and then he turned to his wife. Do you want to say anything to her? He asked calmly. Rosie studied Lyanna for a long moment. Lyanna braced herself. This was where Rashi would finally give her the punishment she deserved. Maybe she'd say something cutting, something that would burn itself into Lyanna's memory forever. Maybe she'd tell her she was worthless, that she would never recover from this. But Rashi didn't do any of that. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and said, I don't need to. Lyanna felt like she had been struck again. Rosie didn't need to say anything because the silence, the weight of her composed gaze, the way she had walked through this entire situation with dignity, that was enough. Lyanna had tried to break her, but in the end the only person who had been destroyed was herself. The doors behind Lyanna slid open with a soft hiss, and the cold air from outside rushed in. The security officers motioned for her to step forward. Lyanna swallowed hard, her heart pounding as she turned away from the couple for the last time, and as she walked out of the airport she knew one thing for certain. She had spent her entire career believing she had the power to decide who belonged, but today she had learned the most painful lesson of all. Power was never about the uniform, it was about the way you treated people, and she had failed. The airport doors slid shut behind Lyanna, cutting her off from the world she had once controlled. The moment she stepped outside, the cold air hit her like a slock, one that didn't just sting her skin but her pride, her arrogance. As travelers rolled their suitcases past and taxis pulled up to pick up passengers, airport staff went about their daily business. No one noticed who she was, or that she had been walking these halls just hours before as a senior flight attendant who was respected. Now she was no one, and her hands shook as she clutched the strap of her small bag. Her career was over, her reputation was shattered, and the life she had worked so hard to build had fallen apart in one flight, all because of a mistake. She bitterly told herself, no, it wasn't a mistake, it was a choice she had made to judge Rose, to treat her like she was beneath her, and to hit her when she didn't get the reaction she wanted. Now she was paying the price for it. Her legs hurt as she walked toward the taxi stand. The security guards had left her at the curb because their job was done. She wasn't going to be arrested. Rajan hadn't pressed charges against her, even though he could have. That would have made things worse. He could have destroyed her. Instead, he had let her do it to herself. Lyanna swallowed hard as she reached the front of the taxi line. The driver barely spared her a glance as he popped open the trunk for her. She tossed her bag inside and slid into the back seat, her mind still spinning. Where to? The driver asked, his voice indifferent. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Where was she supposed to go? For years the airline had been her home. She had spent more time in airports and airplanes than she had in her own apartment. The job had been everything to her. Her identity, her power, her entire life, and now that it was gone she realized she had nothing outside of it. Her throat tightened. Just drive, she murmured. The driver shrugged and pulled out of the airport, merging onto the road. As the city blurred past her window, her mind kept replaying everything: the way passengers had watched her downfall, the way Hada had looked at her with disappointment instead of sympathy, the way Rajan had barely spoken a handful of words to her but had still dismantled everything she had once believed about herself, and then there was Roz, who had never raised her voice, who had never tried to humiliate her back, who had never needed to retaliate. She had been calm, steady, and somehow that had been more powerful than anything Lyanna had ever seen before. Lyanna had spent so many years believing that power came from status, from authority, from being in control, but Rosie had shown her a different kind of power, the kind that didn't need to prove itself, the kind that didn't need to demand respect, because it had already been earned. Lyanna had spent her entire career looking down on people she thought were beneath her, and today she had learned the truth. The only person beneath anyone was her. The car hit a red light, and for the first time since stepping off that plane, Lyanna allowed herself to truly feel the weight of what had happened. Her hands curled into fists on her lap. She had lost everything, and the worst part, she had done it to herself. The taxi moved through the city, but Lena barely registered the passing streets. She looked at herself in the window and saw a ghost of the woman she had been just hours before. She used to walk with purpose and confidence, sure that she was untouchable in her position. But now she was sitting in the back of a taxi with nothing but a bag of personal belongings and a career she had thrown away because of her pride. Her phone buzzed in her lap, and a cruel part of her hoped for a moment that it might be someone from the airline, giving her a chance to fix things or a last-minute change of plans. But when she turned the screen over, reality hit her like a punch in the gut. A news alert about a senior flight attendant from Aviation Airlines being fired mid-flight for inappropriate behavior toward the CEO's wife. As soon as she tapped the article, her name, actions, and humiliation were written out for everyone to see. Passengers had already started sharing their stories online, detailing every detail of what had happened, including her questioning of Rosny, the insults, and of course, the slap that sealed her fate. A video was attached. Lyanna hesitated, her finger hovering over the play button. She already knew what she would see, still she pressed it. The shaky footage started with her standing in front of Rashi in the aisle, her posture rigid with frustration. The camera caught her sharp tone, the way she tried to corner Rashna with her words, and then clear as day the moment her hand flew across Rash's face. The cabin's collective gasp, the stunned silence, the disbelief, and then the most painful part, Rash's reaction, or rather, she hadn't retaliated, lashed out, or given Lyanna the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had just stood there calm and collected. In that moment, Lyanna hadn't just lost her temper, she had lost the fight. The video ended, and Lyanna let out a shaky breath. She scrolled down to the comments. Well, she really thought she could get away with that. This is why powerful people need to be checked. Think of all the people she's bullied before getting caught. Rosie handled it like a queen, her career is on the line. Lyanna had spent years thinking she was in charge. She had built her reputation on the idea that she knew how to deal with people, get respect, and be the boss in any situation. But in one moment of unchecked arrogance, she showed the world that she was nothing but a bully. The car slowed down, and the driver said, "Ma'am," pulling her out of her daydream. Lyanna blinked and looked up. The apartment building where she lived felt strange. As if it belonged to someone else, someone who still had a job and a future. She pulled out her wallet and handed it to the driver. He didn't even look at her twice. She was just another passenger to him, another nobody. Lyanna got out of the car, her feet shaking as she walked up to the front door. She could already picture her landlord asking her why she was home so early and her neighbors whispering when they heard the news, the crushing reality of having to wake up tomorrow without a job. Reached for the door handle, her phone buzzed to get another notification, this time a direct message from Hannah. She hesitated before opening it. "Hannah, you were awful to her, Lyanna, but I still don't think you're beyond redemption. I hope you learn from this." Lyanna inhaled sharply, gripping her phone tightly. She didn't know if redemption was possible. She didn't know if she could ever fix the damage she had done, but for the first time as she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, she realized something she had spent her entire life believing. The kind of power that mattered didn't come from status, control, or making other people recognize her authority. It came from something else, and the woman she looked down on and tried to make fun of, Rose, had it all along. Lionel had lost everything, but maybe this was the start of something else that she should have learned a long time ago. If you liked this story, please give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.